and welcome everybody from around the world. I saw from the places that people were signing in from, this is probably our most international meeting, maybe since the last Galileo Commission, because I saw that the UK is almost outnumbered, which is a very good thing. And so a very warm welcome to you all. I'm just going to begin. Many of you will have heard the news that the Duke of Edinburgh, his death was announced today at Windsor Castle. And so I'm just going to light a candle for him and have a moment of silence. Thank you very much. I did come across Duke of Edinburgh on 2 or 3 occasions, and 2 of those were when he was a member of the Edinburgh Debating Society called the Speculative Society, which I was also a member of, which was founded in 1764. And he became an honorary member as Chancellor of Edinburgh University in October 1954. So he was the longest ever serving honorary member, I think. And the occasion that he came to one of these meetings was when the debate was on the contribution of Islam to European culture. And he asked to come and talk and rather intervene and be there for that particular meeting. And the last time was about 8 years ago, when he was already well into his 90s. And he came for a dinner at 7 o'clock. And he'd been to Inverness that day, back to Edinburgh, had done 3 engagements. And at 25 past 11, he took his leave and said that he thought he'd done pretty well. So very true. And a real gentleman, enormous charm and engagement. So thank you for your attention for the Duke of Edinburgh. So on to this afternoon's second Galileo summit, which I'm very excited about. We've got over 550 people signed up and over 300 online this afternoon. And I wanted to say a little bit about what I regard as the cultural significance of the Galileo Commission and these meetings. And as you know, we're looking at the fundamental nature of consciousness, essentially even the primacy of consciousness, and a huge cultural shift away from a primacy of materialism and matter towards the primacy of consciousness. And this has enormous implications if we manage to accelerate this transition, which is what our Galileo Commission is devoted to trying to do. And I think in 3 fronts. First is ontologically, that there are deeper structures of reality which consciousness can access. And they tell us something about the nature of the inner world, of the universe, in terms of the fundamental nature of love and light, which is the deep core mystical as well as near-death experience. Secondly, they tell us something about knowing, about epistemology. The fact that we can have access to these deeper structures of reality through our capacity for what the Greeks called gnosis, which is this deeper, direct knowing. And then thirdly, I think the implications are ethical, because the oneness of mind, which is being posited by many people, including some people on the panel today, entails the golden rule, in my view, that if we are one another, then we should treat ourselves accordingly and treat each other accordingly. And so I think that there's this threefold cultural significance to the Galileo Commission initiative at an ontological, epistemological, and ethical level. And I think everybody here is committed to this. And you are our ambassadors in terms of spreading the word in your own circle of influence. So now I'd like to introduce Professor Marjorie Woolacott, He's going to chair this first session. And she is the president of one of the sponsoring organizations, which is the Academy for the Advancement of the Post-Materialist Sciences. And we're very pleased to be working not only with them, but also with the Institute of Genetic Sciences. And we have Dr. Dean Radin on the first panel representing IONS. And so Marjorie, you're going to say a little bit more about yourself and your work and introduce the participants. So I will pass over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, David. And I want to welcome everybody to our first panel discussion. And the topic for this panel is the coming post-materialist revolution and the case for a new scientific paradigm. And I want to say just a little bit about myself, first of all, and that is that I have been a professor at the University of Oregon and doing research in neuroscience for 35 years. And to say that after a few years of teaching, I had a profound meditation experience as a young professor. And I was very intrigued by trying to understand consciousness at a deeper level. And finally, after leading a divided life of being a rehabilitation neuroscientist and a meditator separately for 25 years, I decided I needed to combine these two areas of my life. And I began to do research in my own laboratory on meditation. And I've written a textbook on rehabilitation that's in its 5th edition. And I've also been the recipient of many, many millions of dollars from National Institutes of Health on rehabilitation. So that's a little bit about my background. And I want to say also that our panelists are persons who have been doing research in this area of consciousness studies for almost their entire scientific careers, unlike myself, who started it a little bit later. And I think this topic that we have is a perfect topic for our first panel at our conference, as the current materialist scientific worldview has been dominant during at least the 19th and 20th centuries and now into the 21st century. And again, having been a professor at the University of Oregon for those 35 years, I can say from first-person experience that this is the perspective of the academies of sciences in North America, Europe, and around the globe, and also the granting agencies of these countries, which provide funding for scientific research only if it is within the materialist paradigm. So, of course, that has led to a very narrow focus for research in our major universities of the world, based on the material components of reality and on the brain as the source and the producer of consciousness. So as a neuroscientist trained in the materialist paradigm for most of my career, I can attest to the way this paradigm in the past has restricted the research on consciousness to those areas acceptable to the academy. I should say I had no problem publishing research articles on neural aspects of rehabilitation, but when I submitted articles to the exact same journals of experimental brain research on the topic of meditation, the articles were turned down, usually even by the editors before it went out for review, because they said it wasn't appropriate for their journal. However, I do believe that we are at the point of a paradigm shift, which will support the inclusion of what used to be called paranormal phenomena, as more and more pioneering research scientists like Mario Beauregard, Dean Radin, and Rupert Sheldrake, who are our panelists, add carefully documented, peer-reviewed research studies to our research database, and also become leaders of our societies like those which have supported this Galileo Summit. So our first speaker this morning is going to be Dr. Mario Beauregard. He's a neuroscientist currently affiliated with the Department of Psychology at the University of Arizona. And his groundbreaking work on the neurobiology of emotion and mystical experience has received international media coverage. Mario is the author of Brain Wars, the scientific battle over the existence of the mind, and the book, The Proof That Will Change the Way We Live Our Lives. And his chapter in Expanding Science, which we are celebrating today, which we will now discuss, is actually titled The Next Great Scientific Revolution. Welcome, Mario.
Thank you, Marjorie. I will start with a definition of what has been called by philosophers of science the modern scientific worldview. So this worldview is essentially now, it has become a belief system or an ideology. And at first it was predicated on a number of what we could call metaphysical assumptions, that is hypothesis about the nature of reality. And these hypotheses were first proposed historically by some of the pre-Socratic philosophers. So examples of these assumptions include materialism, the idea that everything in the universe is material. We could also, some use physicalism as a synonym or not, but it's along the same veins. Reductionism is another assumption. You know, the idea that we can reduce all complex systems to more basic elements. You have also determinism and mechanism. And at first, these were considered hypotheses, like I said, but during the 19th century, these assumptions became, they turn into dogmas. And altogether, they formed a belief system that came to be known as scientific materialism. The modern scientific worldview is a synonym. And this worldview has become, like Marjorie just said, very influential in the academic world during the 19th century and also during a good part of the 20th century. And this scientific worldview, the materialist worldview, has several implications for human beings. So for instance, according to this view, mind, what we call mind and consciousness, all that we can subjectively experience, it's either identical or it can be reduced to electrical and chemical processes in the brain. And the brain processes themselves, they are ultimately reducible to the interaction between more basic elements. So it could be cells, but it could be also molecules. And some people are even proposing a reduction to the particle level. Another implication is that what we call thoughts and intentions, they do not really have any effect upon our brains and our bodies, our actions also, and even outside of the limits of our body in the physical world, because according to this view, the mind cannot directly affect at a distance physical and biological systems. And another implication is that we human beings were nothing but complex biophysical machines. And as a result, our consciousness and our personality automatically disappear when we die. So, like I said, this scientific materialism became extremely dominant in the academic world during the 20th century. So dominant, in fact, that a majority of scientists in this academic world started to believe that it was the only rational view of the world. And this has greatly hampered the development of the study of mind and consciousness and also spirituality. For instance, in my field, neuroscience, the term consciousness was taboo till about 1995 with the creation of the research center on consciousness at the University of Arizona. So this gives you an idea. And although there had been a revolution in physics about a century ago, when the physicists started to work with the new equations of what was called quantum physics. Quantum physics has, I would say, invalidated most or if not all of the metaphysical assumptions associated with scientific materialism. And yet, several contemporary scientists still, and philosophers as well, they still hold the scientific materialist belief system. Regarding materialist theories, in my view, I would say that these materialist theories of the mind and consciousness, they have failed to explain how the brain could produce mind and consciousness. And in addition, these theories, they're not able to account for a plethora of empirical findings that are considered anomalous, but they are anomalous only with regard to the materialist worldview. And I give you a few examples here. Psi phenomena. So the research on psi phenomena clearly demonstrate, if we look at all the meta-analyses that have been conducted, and these meta-analyses sometimes include several hundreds or even thousands of studies in few cases. So these studies altogether clearly show that mental functions and abilities, they are not constrained by space and by time and by the boundaries of the body. And so I'm referring to phenomena like telepathy, remote viewing and clairvoyance, precognition also, psychokinesis, and also the what is called the distant mental influence on living organisms, or psyche, PK, pardon me. There's also a very interesting phenomenon called the near-death experience, especially with regard to cardiac arrest. During cardiac arrest, the blood flow to the brain is interrupted after 10, 15 seconds, and the person is considered to be in a state of clinical death. And yet, some experiencers are able, about 15% of them will report perceptions, sense of personality, consciousness, and so on and so forth. So it greatly challenged the materialist theories about consciousness. There's also research about reincarnation, mediumship research, deathbed communications, and so on and so forth. So when we consider the whole of these empirical evidence, it clearly indicates that the brain, that the idea that the brain creates mind and consciousness it's flawed to me. And this leads me to propose a key. How are we going in terms of time, Marjorie?
Basically, I think you have about 5 minutes left.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so I would propose that it's time to switch to what we could call a post-materialist paradigm. And when I use the term post-materialist, I don't mean to, I'm perfectly aware that the materialist view and the method of science based on materialism, they've been very successful and they have transformed the world. So I'm not criticizing that, but I'm simply saying that with regard to other types of phenomena related to consciousness, we need a different paradigm. And this paradigm is now called post-materialist, and I have 4 aspects to present. First, mind, what we could call mind, is irreducible, and its ontological status, I would say, is as primordial as that of matter, energy, space, and time. Secondly, there's a very deep interconnectedness between what we could call the mental world, the psyche, and the physical world, or physis. And these 2 worlds are not really separated. They appear to be separated, but to me, they are deeply interconnected because they represent complementary aspects or manifestation that arise out of a common ground. Thirdly, the mind acts as a force, so it can affect the state of the physical world, and it can also operate in a non-local fashion, so beyond the limits of the body, and also beyond the present. Finally, the brain seems to act as a transceiver of mental activity. So the mind works through the brain and nervous system, but it is not produced by it. And I believe, in conclusion, that the materialist worldview, which has dominated science and academia over the last few centuries, it has run its course. And the old paradigm has started to crumble. We can see that by several publications from even some neuroscientists, but also philosophers of science. And a new paradigm has begun to emerge. And as Thomas Kuhn, the philosopher of science, was saying in the 60s, the history of science has been marked by very special moments. And I think we are now in the middle of such a shift. To me, it appears that we're in a period of transition between materialist science and post-materialist science. And this transition in my view, will lead us to the next great scientific revolution. So it will be very important to the evolution of the human civilization. And I believe that this transition will be even more crucial than the transition from geocentrism to heliocentrism. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario. Yes, I think that you're raising really important questions about how this shift may be able to actually occur that we are anticipating. And actually, this particular summit, the Galileo Summit, is really about how we can really facilitate that shift to occur by perhaps educating more and more people about the incredible validity of the research that's in this area. So we're going to be saving our questions for Mario until after the three people have spoken each for about 10 minutes. So now I'm going to be introducing you to Dean Radin. Dean Radin is the chief scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and he's the associated distinguished professor at the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's the author of over 200 technical and popular articles and 4 books, including the best-selling The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, and also Real Magic. And I should say, I really enjoyed reading that book, Real Magic, and I highly recommend it to all of you as well. His chapter in our AAPS volume we celebrate today is titled, Reductive Materialism Explains Everything Except for 2 Small Clouds. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you, Marjorie. It looks like my Zoom connection is not working too well. So I think I'll turn my video off, which will increase my bandwidth. That's okay.
Okay.
And also I want to show I'll show a few slides. Let's see if this works. So do you see these slides? This slide?
Yes. Yes, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. So we're talking about the challenges we face, and I would bring up here the Right Honorable Lord Kelvin, who said in 1900 to the Royal Society, the beauty and clearness of the dynamical theory, which asserts heat and light to be modes of motion, is at present obscured by 2 clouds. The 2 clouds he was talking about are called the luminiferous ether and the ultraviolet catastrophe. What Lord Kelvin did is that 9 months after giving his talk, that Max Planck would solve the problem of the ultraviolet catastrophe with quantum theory. And a few years later, Einstein would solve the luminiferous ether problem with relativity, which reminds us why Niels Bohr said, "Able to make predictions, especially about the future." So today we have 2 more clouds on the horizon. The 2 clouds are qualia and quanta, both of which are associated with the idea of consciousness. Qualia is the idea of subjective experience and awareness, and quanta is talking about the sensitivity of quantum systems to being observed. So as Mario said, that when you think about the brain as a classical physical system, the assumption is that everything about brain, mind, and consciousness are completely understandable via classical physics. This gives rise to phrases like Francis Crick's, that we're nothing but a pack of neurons, or from Marvin Minsky, that we are machines made of meat. But as philosopher Jerry Fodor said, nobody has the slightest idea how anything material could be conscious. Nobody even knows what it would be like to have the slightest idea about how anything could be conscious. And this was said back in the 1990s, and we still have the same situation today. So we're faced with challenges to our prevailing assumptions about consciousness and the brain-mind relationship. One of those challenges is genius. So here in the National Geographic magazine, it proposes to tell us why some people are so much smarter than the rest of us, And yet, when you look at the lives of geniuses, we have no idea. From a neuroscience perspective, we don't know how some people have been so creatively productive for such a long time in their lives. Another challenge is savants. So these are autistic savants, like Kim Peek, who remembered every word of the 12,000 books that he read, or Stephen Wiltshire, who is able to look at a city and then redraw the entire city from memory. Daniel Tammet, a lightning calculator and an exceptional linguist. And then we have stranger cases of savants, like an acquired savant. Jason Paget had no interest in mathematics at all. And then one day he was mugged and hit on the head. And when he came out and was out of his concussion, he suddenly was obsessed with mathematics, and he draws these very sophisticated images by hand and had previously no interest in mathematics at all. And we have the case of spontaneous savants. This is when a person instantly blossoms into a savant and no one knows why. Or getting hit on the simply one day you wake up and you're an accomplished artist or an accomplished musician. Then we have the case of terminal lucidity. These are cases where people are in coma or have Alzheimer's, or for one reason or another, the brain simply is not working very well. And yet, sometimes hours or days before they die, they become completely lucid. They have full memory, they know who they're talking to, they reminisce about past experiences, and then they die. So this doesn't match our notion either about the relationship of the brain to awareness or memory. And then we have psychic phenomena. So the reason why psychic phenomena is interesting is because it's commonly reported, very high levels of belief around the world, perfectly amenable to scientific study and substantial scientific evidence. So we're talking about clairvoyance, precognition, psychokinesis, and telepathy. So I'll just briefly mention a bit about telepathy. So here we have telepathy. It's, in a sense, a merging of minds. In this case, it's showing the two twins close to each other, but it doesn't matter how far apart people are. So in the modern day, this is one of the ways we do telepathy experiments. We have a receiver, put them in a state called a Ganzfeld, where you shine a red light, and then put half a ping pong ball over each eye. And they wear headphones. And you have someone at a distance who is going to try to send a randomly selected target. So in this case, if the target was a bunny, that's what the sender's task is. So you then take the receiver, well, this is an actual case where the sender's trying to send an elephant, and what you would expect the receiver to get is not necessarily exactly an elephant, but something like that, like an animal that's gray. Then you take the receiver out of the Ganzfeld condition, you play back anything they said aloud, you show them 4 pictures, one of which was the real target, and then 3 decoys. So by chance, they would get it right 1 in 4 times. Very simple experiment, takes quite a while to actually do it, but it's conceptually quite simple. So this has been discussed in detail in top-tier academic journals in psychology, starting in '94 and up to the present day. So as of 2020, there have been 117 studies published after the earliest pilot tests. That many hits and that many sessions. So 0.6% hit rate, where 25% is expected. The probability of that is 10 to the minus 16th, or odds of 10,000 trillion to 1. only 5% over chance. So if we select people who either claim that they have had telepathic experiences or are involved in an artistic endeavor, they actually get a 41% hit rate. It's much, much higher. And even though there's only 367 sessions, the odds are still 10 billion to 1. So there's extremely strong evidence in this line of research. So whenever you do an experiment, you want to look at alternative explanations. So all of these have been looked at in great detail over the years. The one that up until recently we couldn't test was, do skeptics get the same result? And so in 2005, these two professors who said they had no interest or belief in psychic phenomena, they did this Ganzfeld experiment, and they wrote that after 8 studies, they had an overall statistically significant hit rate of 32%, which is even higher than the meta-analysis. And they didn't like this, so they said it was precariously close to demonstrating humans do have psychic powers. If that is all true, then you should be able to do this kind of experiment. So you're looking at brain activity of 2 people keeping each other in mind. You expose one person to stimulus, like a flashing light, that will evoke potential. And now you look at the brain of the receiving party, who's not looking at any flashing lights, to see if there's a corresponding effect. So most people don't realize that this kind of experiment was actually reported in Science in 1964 with a positive outcome, and again in Nature in 1976 with a positive outcome. This has also been looked at under functional MRI, and a very similar idea that you would do flashing lights and then periods with no flashing lights, and you see if the brain of the receiver shows any difference. And the answer is it does. In the occipital lobe, it's the back of the brain where visual images are processed. And then a replication a couple of years later was also successful, and et cetera. So I'm going to stop my slides there. The et cetera part is that I could go on for hours with additional evidence, not only for telepathy, including very clever versions of these experiments by Rupert Sheldrake, and also the other lines of research. So, and Mario was mentioning about one of the challenges for understanding materialism and whatever happens after materialism. There is an enormous body of evidence, not just genius and savants, but within the realm of psychic phenomena where materialism becomes extremely difficult to describe how these things may work. So those are my comments.
Thank you, Dean. I appreciate that. Yes, and I think that we'll have probably in our discussion a lot to say about people like savants, and especially spontaneous savants, where this just happens suddenly, and what that really means in terms of what's going on in our brains and our non-local communication. So thank you, and we'll look forward to our discussion. So now we will be hearing from Dr. Rupert Sheldrake. And he is a biologist and an author of more than 85 technical papers and 11 books, including Morphic Resonance, The Nature of Formative Causation, and Science Set Free, 10 Paths to New Discovery, also called The Science Delusion in the UK. He was a fellow of Clare College in Cambridge, where he was director of studies of biochemistry and cell biology, and was also a research fellow of the Royal Society. And he is a co-founder of the Campaign for Open Sciences to promote the movement toward a post-materialist science. And his chapter in our AAPS volume that we're celebrating today is Setting Science Free from Materialism, and he'll be discussing that. Welcome, Rupert.
Thank you. In my chapter, I discuss the 10 dogmas of contemporary science. There's what Mario called the scientific worldview, which is what it's usually called. What it is really is the philosophy of mechanistic materialism. And this has become a kind of dogmatic belief system for many scientists. Most of them are unaware of the fact that it is a belief system. They just think it's the truth. And it's particularly strongly entrenched in people who, not even necessarily scientists themselves, but are devotees of the cult of scientism, people who've made science into a kind of religion. So what I'm going to do is go through these 10 dogmas very briefly and show how we can move beyond them, again, very briefly. The first dogma is that everything is essentially mechanical. Dogs, for example, are complex mechanisms rather than living organisms with goals of their own. Even people are machines. We are lumbering robots, in Richard Dawkins' vivid phrase, with brains that are like genetically programmed computers. This has been the foundation of modern science since the scientific revolution of the 17th century. The machine theory of nature was established as early as 1620. It first came to René Descartes, the French philosopher, in a vision. And he made a separation, as I'm sure most people know, between unconscious mechanical matter, which is what makes up nature, and mind, or spirit, which is not material, which is outside space and time. It's a radical dualism. And what's happened is that science has gone on with this mechanistic view of nature. It comes in the terminology, you know, mechanistic, what's the mechanism, genetic engineering, biotechnology, you know, factory farming. Living organisms are machines, we're machines. But when you think about it, it's only a metaphor. It's not a testable scientific theory. You can't do an experiment that proves something is a machine or an alternative, an organism. And in fact, for many purposes, it's more appropriate to think of organic metaphor. Living organisms are more like living organisms than like machines. The whole universe is more like an organism than a machine. It's starting with the Big Bang, rather like the hatching of the cosmic egg. And it's been growing and expanding ever since, with new structures coming into being within it, rather like a developing embryo or plant on a gigantic scale. Nothing like a machine. So the philosophy of organism, which Alfred North Whitehead, the great philosopher in the 20th century, proposed, is an alternative view. Nature is made up of organisms like Gaia, the earth, and animals and plants and us, and even galaxies and solar systems are like organisms. The whole universe is an organism rather than a machine. Secondly, the assumption is that all matter is unconscious. It has no inner life or subjectivity or point of view. Even human consciousness is an illusion produced by the material activities of brains. This again was an assumption built into science in the 17th century by René Descartes and other founding fathers of modern science. And it's simply never been proved or tested. It's simply taken for granted. Matter's unconscious. However, because it's become increasingly difficult for materialists to deny that we are conscious, although some of them have tried to do so, the existence of our own consciousness is called the hard problem in the philosophy of mind. And to try and solve it, increasing numbers of philosophers of mind and neuroscientists are adopting a panpsychist view that there's some kind of subjectivity or consciousness at all levels of nature. And this is a movement that's growing and accelerating at present. One of my own contributions to it came out 2 days ago in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, a paper called Is the Sun Conscious, which is the cover story of this issue of the journal. You can read the text online. It's on my own website, sheldrake.org, for example. So the idea that everything's unconscious is giving way to a more panpsychist view. Then there's the idea that the total amount of matter and energy is always the same, with the exception of the Big Bang, when all the matter and energy of the universe suddenly appeared. Well, this again is nothing but an assumption, and physicists now think that 95% of reality is made up of dark matter and dark energy. We haven't a clue what they are, what they do, how they come into being, whether the total amount is the same or not. And in fact, most theories of cosmology think that as the universe expands, the amount of energy increases. So the universe has become a perpetual motion machine. If you ask your materialist friends, is the total amount of dark matter the same at all times and in all places? They can't possibly answer that question. We know nothing about it. We don't know if it's conserved or not. So we don't know whether this fundamental principle applies to 95% of the material universe, according to modern science. Then there's the idea, as the assumption 4, the laws of nature are fixed. They're the same today as they were at the beginning, and they will stay the same forever. This is the familiar idea that all the laws of nature were fixed at the moment of the Big Bang. Actually, I think it's much more likely they're sort of habits that evolve along with the universe, and there's a kind of memory in nature. This is the basis of my own ideas about morphic resonance. So the idea that laws are fixed is a pure assumption. No one was there at the moment of the Big Bang to test this assumption. It's just something scientists take for granted with no basis in empirical tests. Fifthly, nature is purposeless and evolution has no goal or direction. This again is a pure assumption. It follows from the machine theory of nature. Machines don't have purposes of their own. And so again, it's just simply taken for granted with not a shred of evidence. 6, all biological inheritance is material, carried in the genetic material DNA and other material structures. Again, this is an assumption that was the basis of neo-Darwinian evolution. But first of all, genetic inheritance is now supplemented with epigenetic inheritance, which is now a major part of biology, the inheritance of acquired characters. And secondly, the genomic studies have revealed that large amounts of inheritance can't be explained by genes. It's called the missing heritability problem. And I think that this is because morphic resonance is playing a large part in inheritance. 7th assumption, minds are inside brains and are nothing but the activity of brains. When you look at a tree, the image of the tree you are seeing is not out there where it seems to be, but inside your brain. This is the materialist assumption, which makes materialists implacably hostile to all psi phenomena. As both Mario and Dean pointed out, the brain is more extensive. The mind is more extensive than the brain. And the attempt to cling on to this belief leads materialists to deny the existence of psychic phenomena, in many cases without even looking at the evidence. They just know they're impossible. Number 8, assumption 8, memories are stored as material traces in brains and wiped out at death. This again is an assumption of materialism. Memories exist, therefore they must be material, therefore they must be in brains. But attempts to find material traces in brains have been going on for more than a century, and they've failed over and over and over again. And I think it's because the memories aren't there. I think the brain is more like a TV receiver than a video recorder and tunes in. I think we're more similar to our past, our own selves in the past. Therefore, the most specific morphic resonance acting on us from the past is from ourselves. I think memories work by morphic resonance, a resonance across time, with the memories leaping, as it were, across time, rather than being stored materially. Assumption 9, unexplained phenomena like telepathy are illusory. Well, this follows from the mind is in the brain assumption, and Dean has already discussed this. I've done a lot of work myself as well. The evidence is overwhelming that these phenomena exist. And the bankruptcy of modern so-called skepticism is revealed by the fact that in a state-of-the-art paper by 2 leading skeptics last year, they actually finally admitted that their position is one of total denial. They said psychic phenomena are impossible, and therefore there's no need to consider any evidence for them because we know in advance it must be flawed or fraudulent or irrelevant, basically. And finally, there's the assumption that mechanistic medicine is the only kind that really works. This worldview is not simply an academic belief system that's mentioned in seminar rooms. It affects public policy, science funding, and medical funding. In most countries in the world, almost all medical funding goes to mechanistic medicine, drugs and surgery, almost none to alternative therapies, which rely on a more holistic view of the body and the relation of the mind to the body. And these therapies, of course, exist. Millions of people, even in North America and Western Europe, hundreds of millions of people go to a whole range of alternative therapists. But from the official medical point of view, they're simply dismissed as quackery or, at very best, placebo effects. So these are the assumptions on which current mechanistic materialism is based, the basis of our entire scientific educational system in schools and universities. And as Dean and Mario have pointed out, the basis of science funding. And this is the worldview that all of us are here today to talk about going on beyond. And as I've shown, as soon as you question these assumptions and open them up, whole new perspectives appear, which would make science a lot more interesting and a lot more fun. Thank you.
Thank you, Rupert. I really appreciate the comments, and I appreciate the fact that you and the two other participants on our panel have really shown that the evidence is out there. It's out there published really all over scientific journals, and is continuing to be published. And as you say, people just don't want to hear it. They say that it can't be true. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. I'd like to now open it up to a few questions to our panelists from each other. And then later on, we'll be turning to some of the other questions from the group, all of you participating. So maybe I can just start with one question, first of all, for Mario, if that's okay, Mario. You mentioned in your chapter that you had proposed that conscious and unconscious mental events are specifically encoded by the brain, and through a psychoneural transduction mechanism into neural events. And I want to know from you and from the other two panelists, Rupert and Dean, have you a model of how this might happen, and or how we could go about determining the basis for this transduction? I find that a fascinating idea as a neuroscientist, but yet I don't know exactly how to put it into my mind as a true model. So perhaps Mario and then Rupert or Dean can respond.
Okay, well, if we consider language to be the ability to convey information, I've proposed in 2007 that there's a language for the mind and there's a language for the brain, and the language related to the mind, we could call it mentalese. So in the language of the brain, the neuronese, and these terms have been used before by other people. So what I proposed there was simply that there's the neurons and other levels also of the brain, molecular levels and other levels. There seems to be a transduction of information from the mind level, for instance, a thought, an intention, a transduction into an information, but at the physical level that can guide biophysical processes, for instance, or biochemical processes like the release of synaptic vesicles, for instance, and neurotransmitters. And so so I tried to started to test this thing, and I did some testing. I used positron emission tomography to measure what was happening to neurotransmitters in the brain. I did that at the Montreal Neurological Institute a long time ago, in 2007, 2008. And for instance, I was comparing what's happening if you feel a negative emotional state, sadness, for instance, a negative emotion, versus a positive emotion. Yeah, the information must be different, and so the end result of this transduction must be also different. So comparing these two emotional states, we discovered that we were targeting serotonin because it's involved in mood regulation, as you know, and a neurotransmitter that is related to antidepressant drugs as well. So we targeted this chemical system, and what we saw is that we were measuring the synthesis and the release of serotonin in the brain. And so for sadness and for happiness, the brain regions involved were the same, except that for happiness, there was an increase in terms of production and release of serotonin in various parts of the so-called limbic system or emotional brain. And for sadness, it was the opposite pattern. So that's what I mean by, so any thought, any emotion would be translated in, there would be specific biophysical and biochemical responses to our thoughts, our intentions, our emotions, and so on and so forth.
Thank you, Mario. In fact, as you're saying that, you've given me a new insight in that the reductionists, like I used to be, would simply say, well, the emotion is simply the serotonin being released in the brain.
Right,
they don't
right.
think of it as separate. And so they say, well, it's all explained. But the point is that emotion is very, very different from brain activity. And
Right.
that's what we have to really help everyone understand, that that's the real transduction that's happening. So thank you. And Rupert or Dean, do either one of you have anything to add?
Okay, well, I'll say something. I think of these, the mental activity as being related to what I call mental fields, which are extended in space and time. When we look at something, like I'm looking at your picture on the screen now, Marjorie, I think my image of you is where it seems to be on the screen, not inside my brain, and that every perception involves a projection out. And I think the fact that these fields of mental fields that we project out can affect what we look at. For example, the sense of being stared at, I think, arises because people can feel the field of my mind if I'm staring at them, even from 100 yards away or more. So I think these fields also work on our brains themselves by modulating the probabilities of electromagnetic patterns of activity. I mean, I think the interface of the electromagnetic wave patterns that happen in the cortex and in the hippocampus and in the sharp wave ripples and theta waves and so on. And there's a lot of work now on brain rhythms. Buzaki is my favorite author in this area. Georgi Buzaki, in his book, The Brain from Inside Out, has a very good description of this extremely detailed work on brain rhythms. But those alone, I don't think, explain consciousness or mental activity, but I think they are the interface that what I call morphic fields interact with electromagnetic fields and modulate these brain rhythms and in turn are influenced by them. And these fields are within and around the brain. So I would see it as involving another kind of field working through electromagnetic fields. That's my own particular hypothesis. And because these fields, morphic fields, are influenced by morphic resonance across time, they also carry memory within them. So memory is part of this hypothesis. It doesn't require some extra hypothesis. It comes for free as part of this morphic field hypothesis.
Thank you. And then just to quickly trying to combine it with Mario. So is perhaps the idea that the emotion that Mario was talking about, whether it was sadness or depression, could be considered part of this morphic field in a certain sense, and that that is then is what is being transduced into brain activity?
Yes, very much so. And so these fields, we're talking now about the sort of temporal and spatial fields that interact with physical events. But the fields experienced from within would include qualia, subjective sensations, emotions, and so on. Now, exactly how that works, of course, is not known. We're dealing with the very limits of understanding and speculation at the moment.
Yes, great, thank you. And Dean, do you have anything to add? And I don't hear you. David, you're muted. You're trying to talk.
Sorry, he temporarily dropped off, but he's just reappeared. So he might. You tried the question again.
So Dean, I'm wondering whether you have anything to add about this question of what might be this psychoneural transduction mechanism that goes on between perhaps our thoughts and the activity in our brains, how that mind-brain interaction occurs.
I'm sorry, you have to ask that again because my internet seems like it's slowly reviving itself.
Okay, so it's talking about this psychoneural transduction mechanism, the mind-brain interaction, and whether you have any ideas yourself about how we really get thoughts and thoughts of others, basically what we might call non-local interactions into our brain to actually produce changes in the brain? What's going on?
Well, of course, nobody knows. One speculation, I actually have two speculations. One is that there are aspects of the brain that are operating at the quantum scale. I think this is very likely, and the evidence for quantum biology is already going in that direction. In which case, we have evolved as partially quantum creatures, and where we're partially located, like around our body, but partially not located around our body. In which case, when we think about how perception works, it works by getting information through ordinary senses. But even if our ordinary senses are spread out in space and time, then some part of us has always evolved into a way of being able to perceive in a quantum fashion, meaning non-locally. So that's a more or less conventional scientific path that might turn out to be true. The other, of course, is that materialism has its limits and is successful, but only in certain circumstances, in which case a more comprehensive philosophy like idealism is a way of understanding then how we're able to overcome the limitations of classical physics, or maybe any physics, because consciousness is actually fundamental. So those are the two hypotheses that I juggle. One or both, or maybe none of them are correct, but that's about the best guess I have right now.
And can you give us a 1-minute definition of idealism for participants that might not understand?
Idealism is the philosophy which assumes that consciousness is fundamental, is somehow part of the fabric of reality. And by being fundamental, meaning that it is more fundamental than the physical world. So the physical world emerges in some way out of pure awareness. That's essentially idealism.
Thank you, thank you. And I'm now going to check in with David because I noticed that it's 2 minutes after the hour, and we had talked about possibly having a bio break, and I want to say whether this is a good time or not. David?
Yes, I think that it is a good time. So I think we can have a fairly short one, sort of 3 or 4 minutes. And then we'll take some of the many questions that have come up in the chat. They're coming in at the rate of sort of 2 or 3 a minute. So I don't think we're going to get through all of them, but we'll see what we can do.
Okay, so I'm hearing that we're probably not going to then try to have any breakout groups. So we're just going to have maybe a pause, and then we'll go back to our questions.
Exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
Fine. So shall we give us at least a 5-minute pause then, and then we'll be coming back?
5 minutes sounds good.
Okay. We'll see you all in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
There they are.
Okay, great. And maybe what I can do now is actually take one of the questions from our participants, because it actually relates to a question I was going to ask our panelists as well. So I'll read the question from the participant and then maybe add a little bit of my own. So this is one from Bethany to everyone, and she says, I'm curious to hear the panelists' thoughts on what post-materialist science would look like in practice for researchers who are conducting scientific studies. Does something need to change in the scientific method, or the specific research methods that we use, or the topics that we study, or the perspective of the scientist, or perhaps some combination of these? So I thought you might simply give her some ideas about how you imagine our post-materialist world. And I would just add, if you had all the grant funding in the world, all the academies and funding agencies were willing to give you the money, what would we be doing? So who would like to start?
Okay, I'll start if you like.
Okay, Rupert.
Well, I think, first of all, in the realm of medical research, which is one of the areas that's so important for all of us, I think I'd move on to a comparative effectiveness basis. If there are people suffering from problems like migraines or cold sores, or common problems that modern medicine is not very good at, I'd run trials comparing all methods that claim to treat this: homeopathy, acupuncture, Chinese traditional medicine, Indian Ayurveda, etc. Anyone who claims to treat them, test all these methods, just find out what works. without any ideology or dogmatism. And even if the, say, homeopathy worked best, then undoubtedly some people would say, well, it's just because they're getting a bigger placebo effect. To which the answer would be, well, what's wrong with that? Placebo effects work. And if people get better and get better cheaper with homeopathy, then that would be the method of choice, for at least for many people. So I think pragmatic medical research would be one way of doing it. Pragmatic agricultural research would be another way of doing this. Right now, the emphasis in agricultural research is on treating seeds as if they're just carriers of DNA, and it's all about patenting genes, genetically modifying crops, CRISPR, gene editing, etc. Obsessed with genes. Well, I'd look at agriculture in a way that looking at multiple cropping systems, ways of dealing with pests and diseases that rely on building up the soil, microflora and fauna. I'd look at epigenetic seed production, producing seeds under conditions of stress where it's already known that the offspring develop better as a result of epigenetic inheritance. Existing seed production ignores the way the seeds are grown. They're just seen as packages of DNA. So those are two applied areas. And then in other areas like to do with neuroscience, I'd look at morphic resonance theories of memory, transfer of memory from rodents to other rodents in standard experiments, see if morphic resonance is facilitating learning. I've got a whole range of morphic resonance experiments that I personally would want to see happen if I were given this unlimited grant that Marjorie's imaginarily proposed. So those are just some of my ideas.
Beautiful, thank you. And Dean or Mario?
Yeah, so I have a few ideas.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of pragmatism, I don't think even if post-materialist ideas were taught widely and accepted, it wouldn't change the way that most science works, because materialism is very effective as a approach to studying reality, and a lot of it is yielded its secrets to materialism. But I think what may happen is that we will see materialism as a special case that only applies to certain areas of physicality. And so when we have a more expanded view of whatever we call post-materialism, whatever that is, the main area of research that I think we would need to do, besides additional psi research and the areas that Rupert had mentioned, is on epistemology. Because the moment that we get out of a materialistic viewpoint and we're dealing with phenomena that transcend space and time, our conventional epistemologies don't work anymore. Because in science today, we assume that systems are relatively separate or completely separable. And we also assume that controls, which are, of course, extremely important in any kind of experimental science, that controls mean that you're able to isolate one system from the next. And yet when we look at, especially at psi phenomena, there is no control. There is no separation. There's no way to completely isolate one system from the other, not only through space, but through time. So we don't have any epistemologies that tell us with any degree of certainty how to study systems that are connected through time. So if I had unlimited funds, I would throw a bunch of people who know about epistemology together in a room and start banging on this problem, because otherwise we won't be able to make that much progress, even if people begin to accept that the phenomena are real.
Well, thank you. And you reminded me right now from your own experiences and others where we see that people can actually have precognitive understanding of what might be coming up in the future or is coming up in the future. It means that if we could really understand that, it would be an amazingly powerful phenomenon within this world in terms of our ability to perhaps control things in a more positive way about knowing in advance what might be coming, or probabilities anyway. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you. And Mario, I don't see you yet on my screen, but if you're there, do you have anything to add?
Well, yes. To me, post-materialist science would be much more open to, and is more open regarding spirituality and spiritual experiences, and the so-called invisible world. So, given that we have the necessary technology, we would be allowed to investigate other, for instance, planes of existence, other domains of reality. That's something I would do personally. And post-materialist science is a science of interconnectedness between all levels of reality. Like, well, and it would be like an extension of psi research, really. But I would be interested in learning more about all the interconnection between not only humans, but humans versus animals, humans versus trees, and so on and so forth. And I know some people are doing work regarding water, for instance, which seems to respond a lot to emotions and intentions. And so I would push this field of investigation, but I would be really interested also in, like I said, the other planes of reality, if you will, other dimensions, if you will.
Yeah, thank you. And in fact, as you're saying other dimensions, I'm thinking about the people that are trying to do research, for example, with mediumship, to actually have some communication with someone that might be on the other side. So you're imagining that maybe we could really learn more about that place where perhaps people still exist consciously in another realm, and create more appropriate methods for communicating and really learning about that.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be seen as taboo as much, then. In such a context, it would be, considered interesting research.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think you raised the phenomenon that one of the things we have to change is the medical profession's idea that you must have some sort of a pathology if you're hearing from people that are your relatives who have died, and rather see it as, in fact, a great way of learning more about other aspects of the universe in a certain sense.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Now I want to turn to another question. I've kept a couple of questions, at least from our group here. A number of people are asking about the COVID virus, and I'll just give you a few questions and people can answer as they like. One is, does the COVID-19 mutation spread around the globe due to morphogenic resonance rather than direct contact? Maybe I'll let, we'll have Rupert answer that one and say, what do you say to a question like that, Rupert?
Well, I think there's some evidence with the spread of antibiotic resistance in bacteria cropping up in different parts of the world, which was studied in the past, suggesting that mutations might occur more easily once they've occurred somewhere else. That would be a morphic resonance effect. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, random mutations occur at random anyway, and so in relation to COVID, you need a lot of data about exactly when each variant appears and whether it starts appearing independently more frequently. It'd be very hard to get the data because people move around, even with travel restrictions. Mm-hmm. So it would be hard to deal with that. One of the things that morphic resonance might apply to is resistance to COVID, because if many people develop antibodies, form a resistance to these virus strains, then it might make it easier for others to form the same kind of resistance. It might happen more readily, so much so that increasing numbers of people might have the disease without even knowing they've got it, be symptomless, because their antibody system is working so well. And actually, large numbers of people are getting the disease in a symptomless way. But again, we haven't got the data on whether this proportion of symptomless infections has increased. There's probably more data on this than almost all other diseases, but and so it might actually be possible to analyze this in due course, but I don't think it's time to do that yet.
Okay, thank you. And one related question was simply, does the COVID-19 virus, is it a conscious organism, and does it have a conscious or unconscious message, aim, or goal? I'll let you answer that perhaps too, Rupert.
Well, viruses are not usually thought of as being potentially conscious organisms, but on the other hand, according to modern panpsychism, where even electrons are considered to have some degree of consciousness, it'd be hard to deny it to the COVID virus or any other virus. But whether they're capable of, to what degree there's any consciousness in this, I don't know. I mean, and after all, ecosystems have consciousness. And if we think that Gaia has consciousness, if I were Gaia thinking, and if Gaia can think, and I'm thinking, what would be the best way to stop humans in their tracks without doing too much harm to human societies? I think coming up with a COVID virus would be absolutely brilliant. If I were in the Gaian Research and Development Department, I'd be quite pleased if I'd thought of it. I mean, many have died, of course, and that's terrible, but the fact is it's not like the Black Death, which wiped out 50% of the population. And it's led to a tremendous decrease in air travel and other forms of wasteful consumption. And it's meant that many people have paused and thought again about their own lives and the way we all live on the earth. Now, I think that does suggest some higher purpose, but it needn't necessarily be embodied in the virus itself. It may not be the virus getting this overview of the future of the earth, but being part of a larger system.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And I'm going to turn now to someone else's question on a slightly different topic for our other panelists too, and that is, would any of you explain how you understand after-death communication? So again, I will let one of you, Dean or Mario, perhaps answer that.
I would nominate Mario to answer that.
Mario, how do you understand after-death communication?
Well, I'm not an expert. I haven't done. I reviewed some, published studies about this, and I've read books. But it looks like if it's possible to communicate with deceased people. That's what it seems. I think it's the most parsimonious hypothesis, and because sometimes. In these form of communications, the so-called deceased people or entity will provide information that in some cases can be confirmed, in the empiric world, our world, the so-called physical world. So, and if we look at near-death studies, I studied near-death studies, especially during cardiac arrest. There's it points in the same direction. It seems that there exist other planes of existence, and that people have other forms of bodies, more subtle, and there is other worlds. There nature and another form of more vibrant structures, buildings, and so on and so forth. And it looks like what is believed by various spiritual traditions, and also what is reported by some mediums also. And that I personally believe in this, and I'll tell you why. Because when I was young, at 19 years old, I've been very, very sick. My brain has been infected by viral viruses, and I've had myself a near-death experience. And if I believe in what I was, so I've had all the classic elements, and I was guided by what appeared to be a being of light, and the being of light knew that I was skeptical to a certain extent, so he gave me pieces of information that I could verify later in the physical world. And everything he told me happened after a few weeks or a few months, and so on. So personally, that's how I conceive this thing. I really believe in the continuity of personality, consciousness, and the existence of other planes.
Yes, thank you. Yes, and I just wanted to add that I was part of a study that Chris Rowe at the University of Northampton and Evelyn Elsesser and others had been working on. And there certainly were many examples of what you're talking about, what we would call veridical or accurate, valid descriptions from the person on the other side, the mother or the father, saying where something was that had been lost, et cetera, that made this idea that consciousness does survive death certainly a lot stronger to me. And I know some people say, well, maybe that's just information out there now non-locally in the universe and not an individual doing it. And that's where perhaps we need that extra money from the various national science foundations to help us understand whether it's truly individuals on the other side or a broader memory base. And maybe Dean wants to add to that, because I think you have your own ideas, Dean.
Marjorie, could I just cut in there to say that I've put the booklet from the ADC study into the chat for anybody who wants to download that.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Yes. And now, Dean, would you like to add?
What I wanted to say is that if we take materialism seriously, it's very difficult to imagine that consciousness can survive the body's death. If we instead think of it in terms of an idealist view where that consciousness is fundamental, then from that perspective, there could be many, many different ways that consciousness can be embodied, right? So we enjoy a certain kind of human embodiment and consciousness appears in a certain way for us. But maybe the sun can be conscious, as Rupert was arguing, or a giant gas bag, or just electromagnetic sprites out there. From that perspective, then, the idea that a person's body can die and some aspect of them can continue in some other form. And of course, from the esoteric literature, it is said that we have multiple bodies, some of which are physical and some are not so physical. So again, from a conventional viewpoint, a conventional scientific viewpoint, it's very difficult to understand how anything could possibly survive, in which case, even if you were to accept the evidence from mediumship, that mediums can get accurate information, to take the next leap and say that the information is coming from a dead person in some other body, that is really difficult to jump to. So again, taking a slightly different worldview, it's suddenly no longer so difficult to understand. It's that kind of argument that has drawn me more towards idealism and away from materialism.
Yes, I tend to agree with you. And one of the things I'm thinking about too, when I even talk to people that are trying to learn quote unquote mediumship, what they say often is that when they're trying to work with somebody who wants to have a communication with, for example, their mother who is deceased, they say they have to be careful that they aren't simply reading the person's mind of the person in front of them. And they have to literally try to shift their awareness, like the way they express it is up above their own mental apparatus, to try to connect with someone else beyond the person in front of them. So they're aware that both of those factors can be part of communication, and sometimes they won't necessarily know which it is unless there's something really obvious about the person from the other side coming to them in a real, for example, auditory or visual way. So it's interesting. Yes. Anyone else want to add to that, or shall I move on to another question? I don't hear anything more. So I'm going to go on to one more that says it's for Dean Radin. Does the heart also play a role similar to the brain as a transmitter/receiver?
Well, there are some who say that is the case.
Yes.
I would say it's not only the brain and the heart, but the stomach and all the rest of the nervous system that are involved in the experience of being embodied. Mm-hmm. So yes, the brain's important, and the heart and all the organs and everything, probably even the muscles and the skin. Yeah, we're a holistic system. It's difficult to think about being human when you start taking away senses and organs. It's, we're a different creature at that point. This is one of the arguments against the robots becoming conscious, right? If they do achieve consciousness, it would be of a very different kind, I think, than what we think of as consciousness.
That's a very good point. I guess you're reminding me of all the research that's been done about the receptors that are all over our body to receive, in this case, just sensory information, but from within the body and from outside. And that includes neurons in the heart, neurons in the brain, and as you say, everywhere. So it's really hard to like separate out and say it's only the senses going to the brain is the point.
Yeah. So just to give an example, the phrase gut feelings is a synonym for intuition. So we did an experiment where we measured with an electrogastrogram the electrical activity of the gut. And it looks very much like an EEG signal, which is not too surprising because there's a high density of the same kind of neurons in your gut as there are in your brain. So rather than measuring brain effects, we were measuring gut effects to see if there was a relationship with another person at a distance, and in fact there was.
Wow. So that's wonderful. So gut communication, brain communication, heart communication are all possible. So
yeah.
Yes, thank you. Okay. So I'm looking at others. Question, is mathematics real? And is this question important for the new paradigm? How do we fit mathematics into our new paradigm in addition to our old? So who would like to answer that?
Well, so I'll say, is mathematics real? Yes. Mathematics is the language of science. You can go all the way back to Plato and thinking about, well, where does it come from? Why is it so incredibly effective? And so as part of my studies of the esoteric literature, you can see mathematics as a symbolic language, which it is. And if you go to places like the Kabbalah, then from those traditions, the entire universe is created out of symbols. So maybe it's not so surprising then that mathematics is a representation of reality itself. You create reality out of symbols. So from a, again, conventional point of view, what I just said is nonsense. From an esoteric point of view, that's exactly what mathematics is. It's a symbolic language that represents reality.
And you're reminding me that my friends who are mathematicians actually consider it a very beautiful art form, that they find that working in mathematics brings them great joy, like a musician actually playing with their musical instrument and music. So interesting.
I would say that this is a debate that goes way back, thousands of years. The Platonic view or Pythagorean view that mathematics exists transcending space and time is a kind of deeper reality than the rest of the world. It's an idea that appealed to Plato and Pythagoras. It appealed to Newton and Descartes and the founding fathers of modern science. It appeals to mathematicians and theoretical physicists because it means they're not inventing mathematical models of reality, they're discovering deeper truths, which in some sense are in the mind of God, to use Stephen Hawking's view of it. So this is, I think most mathematicians and theoretical physicists are secret Platonists. Some of them are overt Platonists, like Roger Penrose, but most of them it's fairly secret because they know it's not very fashionable. On the other hand, there are those like myself who think that mathematics is a human-made set of models that more or less accurately fit reality. They're helpful in science, less helpful in biology than physics. I mean, I can't say that my understanding of embryology or of plant growth has been much illuminated by maths. Once one's talked about some plants have 3, 4, or 5 petals and some have a Fibonacci series of spiral arrangement. But once you've said that, the maths sort of peters out in botany. So I think that, again, this discussion goes back to Plato and Aristotle. Plato thought reality was transcendent truths beyond space and time. Aristotle thought the souls, the organizing principles of nature, were immanent within nature, not transcendent. And I think so too. And so I'm a kind of Aristotelian. I think Dean's more of a Platonist. But I don't think we're going to resolve it this afternoon because it hasn't been resolved for a very, very long time. And I think in the new paradigm, there are still going to be debates about the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and its true nature.
Mhm.
Thank you. And you're actually bringing me to another question that I wanted to ask the three of you myself, and that is when we talk about panpsychism, which you brought up, Rupert, it seems that when I talk to people about panpsychism, some people say, oh my goodness, that's a materialist point of view, and I definitely don't believe in it because I'm an idealist, I believe consciousness is primary. And others that say, no, 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 that is part of the understanding that consciousness is primary. So can you help us understand the nuances of what people mean when they talk about the variations of panpsychism?
Well, I think that the common or garden panpsychism today that we encounter in philosophy of mind is what one could call physicalist panpsychism. Basically, they're trying to solve the problem of the existence of human consciousness. And they're aware that this is a hard problem, and to have it emerge from brute matter, which is totally unconscious, just by saying it emerges, doesn't really work. So in order to make the difference one of degree rather than kind, they suppose that there's some kind of consciousness or experience in atoms, electrons, molecules, and so on. And then it can emerge in brains as just more complex. But the fact is that they're trying to solve the problem of consciousness by basically, say, endowing electrons and protons and things with some kind of consciousness that doesn't make the slightest difference. It's like epiphenomenalism all the way down. And indeed, many of them, like Galen Strawson, would say, I'm a materialist. And the best way to be a materialist is to expand the definition of matter to include consciousness, not that the consciousness actually does anything or makes any difference to science, doesn't allow for psychic phenomena or anything like that. It's a very conservative kind of panpsychism. That's probably the most common kind in the academic world. One reason I wrote my paper on Is the Sun Conscious is to try and move this debate on. Because if you say, then even electrons and atoms are conscious, usually they stop when they get to the human brain, because the whole point is to try and explain human consciousness. But if you take it further and say, what about the sun? What about the solar system? What about the galaxy? What about the entire cosmos? Then panpsychism gets more interesting. And one of the reasons that I'm trying to push this debate myself is because I think it ought to be more interesting. Then there are those, you see, there are idealists, as Dean says, who see panpsychism as too limited. I myself am not an idealist. I think that my own ultimate view of consciousness is Trinitarian. We have an ultimate Trinitarian view of consciousness in Hinduism, Sat Chit Ananda, in Christianity, the Holy Trinity, and in many other forms. But basically, this says there's a ground of all consciousness, which is Sat in Hinduism, a ground of being. Chit is the contents of consciousness, names and forms, as the Hindus call them, nama rupa. And Ananda is joy or bliss, but it's also the moving principle, which they call Shakti. In the Christian Trinity, it's the Holy Spirit. So you have energy, which is the spirit principle, and the Logos principle is forms, which in the scientific view are given by fields. They're what organize the forms of nature, and then a ground of both. And this way, you don't have to go to pure undifferentiated consciousness, that in these models of consciousness, these theological models of consciousness, ultimate consciousness is not undifferentiated. It has this Trinitarian structure. And that's reflected in all nature according to these religious and theological views. And I think if we're going to talk about consciousness, we can't leave theology out, because after all, theology is about ultimate consciousness. That's its subject matter. And if we amputate ultimate consciousness from our worldview, then it's still a very truncated one.
Thank you, Rupert. And I just want to maybe a little bit more of explanation, and maybe we can also hear from Dean or Mario, but I'm understanding from some of the philosophies from the north of India from around, I think, 1,000 years ago or so, they talk about this ground of being that you're talking about as having two aspects. And one was basically the transcendent aspect, the purely potential aspect, and then also what they would call the power or the Shakti, whatever, that is really part of it. And that then it comes into a form through basically concretizing itself, sort of slowly crystallizing itself slowly down into all of the levels of reality. So is that different than what you were talking about, the Sat Chit Ananda, or?
Oh, it's similar. I mean, there are various Indian formulations. Kashmiri Shaivism is another one. The knower, the known, and the means of knowledge. We have a mind through which we can know things. That's part of the mind too, the knower, the known, and the means of knowledge. And actually the simplest metaphor, the fundamental one in the Judeo-Christian tradition is speech. That I'm the speaker right now. There's a flow of breath going out of my mouth, which carries my words. Without that flow, which is energy, you wouldn't hear what I'm saying. They'd be silent in my mind. So the flow is the energy. The words have form, structure, meaning, connection, structure. You know, each word is different. There's many different words, but unless there's this flow of energy, you can't hear them. And so the idea is that the ultimate source is like both the speaker and the source of energy, the ground. And there's this moving principle, which Indians call Shakti, and there's the formative principle, which in the Christian Trinity is called the Logos, following Plato and that whole Greek philosophical tradition, the ordering or formative or informative principle. And you have to have energy as well. If you just have form, it's static. If you just have energy, it's chaotic with no structure. And if you don't have a common source of both, then you've got two principles which there's no reason they should cohere. Whereas the point about a trinity is you have a ground from which these interacting principles emerge or come forth.
Thank you. And something from Dean or Mario to add?
Well, in my case, remember I thought about the need to recognize the mind in the world, in the universe, and also the physical, the material. And I propose that these are complementary aspects of a common ground of, out of common ground. In my view, this is the ground of being that is discussed in the Vedanta, for instance, in India. Yeah. So we're talking about the same thing.
And Dean?
I admit to having a philosophical prejudice for monism. So, well, I can I understand what Rupert's saying about a trinity, and I like trinities, but why not a quartet or 5 parts or 2.5 parts? So I think it may be part of scientific training that you want to look for what is really fundamental. And maybe out of the fundamental, yes, it splits into 3 parts. And those are the parts that Rupert just described. I still have a sense, though, that there must be, my guess is, my preference is that there really is something that is at the ground level. We may not be able to understand what that is, but that's the feeling I have about it.
Thank you. Yes. Okay, I'm going to switch now to someone's question that, again, could be for all 3 of you, but it's about these morphic resonance fields, Rupert. The question is this: what is the role of imagery and imagination in the memory of the morphic resonance fields? So, role of imagery and or imagination in the memory of these morphic fields. So I'll let you start and then we'll go to the others.
Well, imagery and imagination are one of the things minds do, because I think of consciousness as the realm of the possible. And in that sense, what our minds are about possible actions, primarily consciousness in its ordinary forms, not in high mystical states, but in ordinary everyday consciousness is about choosing among possible actions, it seems to me. And therefore, consciousness is an arena that holds together a whole range of possibilities. Imagery and imagination are about imagining possibilities. I mean, they're possible, and our dreams are full of imagery and created by the imagination. All sorts of unlikely possibilities are explored in our dreams. And art, imagination, novels, fantasies, these are all ways of exploring the realm of possibility. Now, morphic resonance plays a part because it depends on memory. If you had no memory, you'd have no ingredients for the imagination. You couldn't imagine trees if you'd never experienced trees and you had a memory of them. You wouldn't be able to imagine other people's reactions in your dreams unless you were used to interacting with other people, and that would depend on memory. So I think memory plays a part in conscious life in general, through underlying the possibilities we can conceive of or imagine or picture. And these are all part of this realm of possibility which our minds inhabit.
Okay, and I'm going to maybe add a little bit to that too, because I'd like to hear from perhaps Dean and Mario as well. We think about this idea of, and I'm going to now turn to Dean's idea of the autistic savants, for example, and people that can turn into a savant, for example, after an accident or sometimes spontaneously, and how that relates to imagination and imagery. It's almost as if they become knowledgeable in an area they were not knowledgeable in before. So they didn't have the brain memory of experience, and yet somehow something seems almost like it's downloaded to them, if we want to use that term, where now they have access to other ways of imagining or knowing. So maybe you can say a little bit about what you think is going on with a savant.
You're asking me?
Asking you, Dean. Yes. Sorry, I'm staring at you on my screen.
So I'm guessing that a savant would be similar in some respects to genius. And you look at the lives of geniuses, and we're talking about people, individuals whose contributions change civilization in one way or the other. And generally not as a one-shot, but as lifelong contributions. They often describe their experiences as they simply get information and they write it down. So, I mean, Mozart's probably the icon here, where he'd get an inspiration for a concerto and write it down basically note for note with hardly any changes. Well, that's crazy from any conventional perspective, but it does suggest that some aspect of their awareness is able to leap out into the universe and simply get things. What that doesn't tell us, though, is does that mean that there was a Mozart concerto up at Pluto and he somehow pulled it down? That doesn't seem very likely. So where those kinds of inspirations come from, whether it's in a genius or autistic savant or other kind of savant, we don't really know. But the fact that their experience is that they are pulling it down full formed, that is a commonality that you see in all of these cases.
Yeah. And I think that's what I'm intrigued by the fact that Rupert talks about memory being important, and clearly for them to actually write it into music, there is a memory component that has to go along with the intuition or inspiration that comes, and how the two interact together maybe is an interesting question for when we have all the grant money in the world to look at this. Understand how they go together. And I know that, hearing about, thinking about my husband, who happens to be a writer and a poet, when he is working, unlike me, who's the scientist, basically from my left brain to my right hand, and I'm very, very linear, he literally stops and he stares up at the heavens for a while. And then it's as if something comes to him related to the poetry he's writing, and then he writes it down. And I thought, I should do more of that. I could probably get in contact with a lot more inspiration if I paused the mind and its rational left brain thinking and allowed something else to flow through from wherever that is. So.
Yeah. There was a phrase about Einstein, who, of course, wrote extensively about the value of intuition. And the story is that he and his colleagues would be working on some mathematical thing on the board, and they get stuck. And then Einstein would stop and say, I have to give a little tink, meaning think, but with a German accent. I have to give a little tink. So he'd stare off into the heavens, and then he'd come back after a while and have the solution. And of course, his colleagues were wondering what in the world just happened there, but apparently it happened often enough that was one of the legends told about Einstein.
Wow, that's great. And actually, that might relate to a question that came in a little bit earlier up above on our chat box, which was related to education. So you've given the example of a genius and the fact that he can access that. And the question was really, how do we educate our children in the school system from an early age where they might have more access to this creativity, intuition that may be non-local, that's coming in from other places? What would the three of you suggest? And again, I'll let any one of you start.
I would suggest that we have moments where the children can give a little tink, as Einstein did, right? So give a challenging problem and then say, okay, look off into the sky now and wait until you get an inspiration, simply as a matter of practice, along with some suggestions about what that even means, right? So I think in Einstein's case, maybe he had the ability to blank out his mind and just wait for an inspiration, something like that.
I think Joseph Chilton Pearce, who has now died but was a famous developmental psychologist, had said that when children are in that space of open-eyed staring, that's really good, and don't try to turn them into an activity at that moment, but let them be in that place where they're accessing something broader, perhaps. Yep. And what about the other of you? Mario, do you have something to add?
Well, as for me, I would try to down-regulate the filter function of the brain, because, you know, through various means, but it could be breathing exercise, it could be meditation, creativity training, stuff like that. But you need to, if you want to have access to other levels of reality, in my view, you have to tone down the filter function of the brain.
Mm-hmm. And maybe you can teach the audience, if they don't understand our filter function, just a little bit about what you mean by that.
Well, normally this is a concept that has been proposed over 100 years ago by William James and other philosophers. And it's the idea that normally the brain exerts a filter function. So it means that we focus more our attention on things that are related to our survival and our senses and so on and so forth. But if we want to have access to other orders of reality, other levels of reality, like William James was proposing, then you need to influence this filter function. And neuroscience studies are suggesting that this filter function is greatly associated with beta waves, high beta activity when we use the EEG to measure electrical activity in the brain. And it's related to our little mental boxes and anxiety and fear and survival. And so if we can leave these brain waves and reach other space in terms of brain activity. And I've done research about that in my own lab. And what I've observed is that to expand consciousness a lot, and to what I was doing is that I was using sounds, isochronic sounds embedded within music to slow down brain activity, brain waves. And I've done experiments where I was bringing people, their brain they were generating delta waves and EEG and theta waves, the frontier as recorded with EEG. And in that space, it was much easier for these people to be more creative, intuitive, and even to contact what they're reporting, deceased people, from their own family or friends or things like that. So objectively, that's what they were reporting.
That's amazing. And you're reminding me too about the research by Judson Brewer and his colleagues at Yale University on meditators that basically showed in the imaging scans of functional magnetic resonance imaging that this default mode network of the brain, one of those filters actually goes way down in the trained meditators. So it's exactly what you were finding too in the people that you were working with. That's fascinating. And fascinating that they were able to contact perhaps other realms in a certain sense as they are doing that according to your study. Thank you. And Rupert, do you have something to add?
But yes, I think one of the things I do is increase the amount of experiential learning. Right now, it's all left brain stuff, isn't it? Reading, writing, sitting at desks, written exams. And this is very inappropriate for many aspects of science. For example, in biology, in British schools, in kindergarten, they have something called a nature table where you can look at sort of birds' eggs and nests and leaves and fruits and things and flowers. But by the time they enter year one, age 5 or something, real science begins. You know, it's all about cutting things up, the hearts of pump and stuff. And a mechanistic view takes over right from a very early age. You don't any longer look at living plants or animals. You know, in kindergarten, they might have a pet animal like a rabbit that members of the class can stroke. But as soon as you get a bit older, all that's put behind you, and it's all about pumps and tubes and wires and stuff. Likewise, learning about the sky. In schools, there are all these charts with sort of the planets and the sun, and then rockets, and it's all about engineering and rockets. But how often do they go outside and lie on the ground at night after dark and look at the sky and actually learn the names of planets and stars by looking at them? Well, practically never, because after dark's not in school hours. So first of all, I think I'd have a lot more experiential learning. And of course, we already have this in practical classes with physics, you know, optics, when you study refraction and stuff. I loved school practicals where I learned about this not through diagrams in books, but sticking pins on besides glass blocks and drawing lines on optical benches and things. It's so illuminating to see it and understand it. So experiential learning, a lot more of. And secondly, as Mario said, more in the way of spiritual practices, quiet times. Some schools do teach meditation, but singing together is a very powerful spiritual practice. And in many schools here in Britain, they don't do it anymore. They have cuts in the budget. The first thing to go is music. And, you know, they have a kind of grad grind approach. You know, we're more reading, writing, and arithmetic and stuff. Terribly narrow. I've been encouraging some English schools to take children on pilgrimages, walking through the countryside to great holy places at the end of year 6 when they leave primary school, for example, as a kind of rite of passage. And there, in fact, quite a lot had been arranged for last year, but then they were all cancelled because of lockdown. But I think spiritual practices, a range of spiritual practices, including singing, chanting, and possibly paying attention to dreams, because children, you know, young children are very open to the spiritual world and the natural world, and are naturally panpsychist. We encourage them. In fact, children's books are full of talking animals, one of which is Rupert Bear, who, for obvious reasons, was a figure with whom I identified as a child. But by the time they're 10 or 11, they're told Santa Claus doesn't really exist, the tooth fairy doesn't really exist, you know, and then it's a simple step, well, God doesn't really exist, or angels, they're just like the tooth fairy. This is the kind of Richard Dawkins level of argument. But we set up our children for this by encouraging them to be animistic, largely because their parents get an excuse to be animistic through their children until they reach a certain age. And then it's just hard reality of mechanistic reality takes over. So I think there's a lot that could be done to make the education less mechanistic, less materialist. Possibly children might want to share their dreams, so that might be too intimate, but there might be ways in which they pay more attention to their dreams, and instead of just dismissing it's just a dream, they're the main way in which all of us have access to the imaginal realm. It happens every night, and we usually just don't even bother to write them down or remember. So I think there's a lot that could be done. I think some schools, like Steiner schools, have blazed trails in doing as more holistic education. It's not as if it's necessary to reinvent the wheel. One could learn from the best educational programs that already exist, because they've been doing holistic education for a long time. And I think learning from people who've been doing it, putting together a new experimental programs would be the way to go, including forest schools, which are very popular in Scandinavia and involve children being outdoors a lot of the time, even when it's cold and wet.
Thank you. And I notice we're just about on the hour. So I thank you all. I think I could imagine having wonderful schools where we actually had a dream class session at some point where we talked about our dreams as part of our early education. That would be very, very beautiful. I'm going to turn it back over now to David, and he will end the session for us. And we'll have, I think, a pause for about 30 minutes. David.
Thank you very much indeed, Marjorie, and a fascinating session. Thank you very much, the panel members, for your time and ideas, and indeed commitment to this cause, because I think, as I said at the beginning, culturally this is extraordinarily important what we're trying to do here, and has multiple implications. So Marjorie in particular, thank you very much for coordinating that. So what we're going to do now is to take a 30-minute break, and what we're also going to do in terms of procedure is that we're going to end this call, and then we'll reopen using the same link at 6:20, so that you can then get back online in preparation for the start of the next session at 6:30 UK time, 7:30 in whatever 30 it is, wherever you're zooming in from. Andrew, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, that sounds fine. So yeah, as David mentioned, we'll actually stop the call and just use the same link that you used to log in when you joined the call at the start. And that will work again in half an hour.
Okay, thanks so much. See you all shortly.
Thank you.